Evan Hale had always believed that certain friendships were built on quiet, unspoken threads, connections that didn't need words to survive. For years, Mason Reed had been one of those rare constants in his life. So when Mason called late one evening and suggested a mountain adventure to clear both our heads, Evan agreed before he had time to overthink. His instincts told him the invitation carried weight, but the tone in Mason's voice carried something even heavier, something uncharacteristically fragile. When they met at the trailhead 2 mornings later, Mason looked nothing like the confident, steady friend Evan was used to. His usual carefree grin was replaced by a strained half-smile that flickered every time he avoided eye contact. Evan noticed immediately, though he decided not to comment. He'd learned long ago that Mason opened up only when he was ready, and never a moment sooner. As they began the ascent into the pine-thick mountains, the crisp morning air felt charged, as though the landscape itself sensed the tension threading between them. Evan inhaled deeply, letting the cold air settle in his lungs, grounding him. He had joined this trip hoping to escape his own restlessness, but he was becoming increasingly aware that Mason was carrying a storm of his own. Half an hour in, Mason finally spoke, his voice low. "Claire and I fought again." Evan kept his pace steady, resisting the urge to look over too quickly. Claire Donovan, Mason's long-distance girlfriend, was practically a symbol of stability in Mason's chaotic schedule. The fact that Mason was bringing her up so soon into the hike was unusual. "What happened?" Evan asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. "It doesn't matter," Mason muttered, tightening his grip on the straps of his backpack. "Just the same argument, over and over. She thinks I'm not emotionally consistent. That I don't know what I want." Evan let the words settle. Emotional consistency was never Mason's strong point, but Mason had always been sincere. That was what made this shift so baffling. They trekked in silence for a while, their boots crunching against the gravel. Evan watched Mason from the corner of his eye, noticing the way his shoulders seemed to carry more weight than his pack. It wasn't the argument with Claire that bothered him most, it was whatever Mason wasn't saying. As they rounded a sharp bend, the trees parted enough to reveal a sweeping view of the valley below. Mason stopped abruptly, gazing out as though searching for answers in the vastness. Evan paused beside him, waiting. "I shouldn't have dragged you out here," Mason said eventually. "You probably had better things to do." Evan shook his head. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't want to be." Mason's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, his expression softened, almost relieved, but he quickly turned away and continued walking. That fleeting shift unsettled Evan more than the silence that followed. The farther they climbed, the more the terrain changed. What began as a well-worn trail gradually narrowed into a rugged, uneven path. Fallen branches forced them to slow down, and the air grew cooler as the forest thickened overhead. Evan found himself studying Mason more than the landscape, studying the subtle changes in his demeanor, the quiet hesitations that felt out of place. At one point, Mason slipped on a loose patch of gravel, stumbling forward before catching himself. Evan reached instinctively, steadying him with a hand on his arm. The contact lasted less than a second, but Mason froze, as if startled by how quickly Evan had reacted. Mason muttered a thanks, though something in his voice trembled. Not fear, not embarrassment, something else Evan couldn't decipher. They continued upward, the silence stretching again, but not comfortably this time. Evan felt the shift between them like static, the kind that lingered after lightning touched the ground. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was something undeniable, an awareness neither of them had expected. Around noon, clouds drifted across the sun, dimming the forest in a muted gray light. Mason checked his phone, then sighed. "Signal's gone," he said. "Claire was supposed to call." Evan heard the frustration beneath the words, a quiet desperation trying to disguise itself. "She'll reach you when she can," Evan replied softly. Mason nodded but didn't look convinced. Instead, he adjusted his pack and pressed forward. After a few minutes, he spoke again, this time without prompting. "She said I've changed. That I'm distracted. That I'm distant whenever she brings up our future." Evan swallowed. "Have you changed?" Mason hesitated, then answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." It wasn't the answer Evan expected, and the honesty behind it sent a ripple of unease through him. Mason was rarely unsure of his emotions. The ambiguity itself was alarming. They reached a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was colder here, sharper, almost metallic. Evan dropped his pack and stretched, but his eyes stayed on Mason, who stood at the center of the clearing as though he had forgotten how to move. "You brought me out here for a reason," Evan said quietly. "What's going on with you?" Mason exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. "I didn't know who else to talk to." Evan felt something tighten in his chest, not attachment, not hope, but a deep, instinctive understanding that whatever Mason was about to reveal was heavy enough to fracture something between them, even if only temporarily. Before Mason could continue, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, scattering pine needles and shifting the atmosphere from heavy to ominous. Evan glanced upward, noticing the clouds thickening in the distance. "Storm coming?" Mason asked, though his eyes didn't leave Evan's face. "Maybe," Evan answered, though he wasn't sure if he meant the weather or the conversation. Mason took a step closer, then stopped himself. "I didn't plan this trip to escape Claire." "Not exactly." Evan's heartbeat quickened, not from anticipation but from the sense that they were reaching a tipping point, one that neither of them fully understood. "Then why?" Evan asked. Mason hesitated, his expression conflicted, vulnerable in a way Evan had never seen. "Because I'm tired of pretending everything in my life makes sense." The wind swirled again, and for a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Evan waited, sensing that Mason hadn't reached the real confession yet, but instead of continuing, Mason stepped back and turned toward the trail. "We should keep moving. We're losing daylight." He didn't wait for a response. Evan followed, though his mind replayed Mason's unfinished confession like an echo that refused to fade. Whatever truth Mason was carrying, it was starting to leak through the cracks, and as they left the clearing behind them, Evan realized that this trip wasn't just about clearing their heads. Something was shifting between them, something neither of them had the courage to name yet, something that would change the rest of the journey. Evan woke to the sound of rain tapping the windows, the kind of steady rhythm that usually calmed him. But today it only reminded him how empty the other side of the bed felt. Morgan had left early again, quietly, as though slipping out before dawn would erase the tension instead of magnifying it. Evan stared at the ceiling for a long moment before getting up, letting the muted gray of the morning settle over him like a second blanket that he moved through his routine automatically. Coffee, a quick shower, a half-hearted glance at the breakfast he no longer bothered preparing for two. When he opened the front door to leave for a walk, he nearly collided with Cade, who was crouched in the hallway, attempting to fix a crooked doormat with more seriousness than the task deserved. Cade looked up with a sheepish grin. "I think this mat is conspiring against me." Evan smiled despite himself. "Maybe it's trying to tell you something." "Probably that I need more sleep," Cade replied, standing and brushing off his hands. "You heading out?" "Just for a walk," Evan said, tightening the drawstrings on his hoodie. "The rain's peaceful today." Cade raised an eyebrow. "Or depressing, depending on the mood." "Then peaceful it is," Evan answered, and the honesty behind the comment seemed to linger between them. They ended up sharing the elevator, a short ride filled with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and a silence that felt companionable rather than strained. At the lobby doors, Cade paused. "If you want company," he said casually, "I could use an excuse to take a break from unpacking." Evan hesitated only a second before nodding. "Sure." They stepped outside, the misty drizzle rain settling gently on their sleeves. The streets were quiet, the usual city noise softened by the weather. As they walked, Evan found himself talking more than he expected, small things at first, ordinary observations, until the conversation grew into something personal without either of them forcing it. Cade listened attentively, never rushing him, never steering the conversation for his own benefit. Instead, he asked questions in a way that felt sincere, not prying. When Evan mentioned his work, Cade's curiosity led to an unexpectedly animated discussion about creativity, deadlines, and the strange satisfaction of bringing ideas to life. "It sounds like you care more about your clients than they realize," Cade said thoughtfully. "Sometimes," Evan admitted. "Sometimes I think I care too much." "There's no such thing," Cade said with quiet conviction, the words landed deeper than Evan expected. Morgan had once said something similar, but that felt like another lifetime, before work consumed him, before conversations became obligations instead of shared moments. As they walked back toward the building, a gust of wind pushed the rain sideways, making them sprint the last block while laughing like people who momentarily forgot their burdens. Inside the lobby's shelter, both of them shook off the water. Good timing, Cade said, breathing heavily. I almost drowned. Exaggeration, Evan replied, though his smile betrayed him. They rode the elevator up with droplets still clinging to their sleeves. When the doors opened on their floor, Evan felt a flicker of disappointment that surprised him. A simple walk had become the most connection he'd felt in weeks. Thanks, he said, stopping at his door. For what? Cade asked lightly. For talking. Listening. Just that. Cade nodded, no humor this time. Anytime. Evan stepped inside his apartment, and the familiar silence returned like a harsh fluorescent light. It wasn't empty because Cade had filled it, no. It was empty because something inside Evan had finally noticed what had been missing. Hours later, as evening approached, he set the table for two out of habit. Morgan had said he would try to make dinner. Evan arranged the plates anyway, the same way a person tends to a hope that keeps shrinking but refuses to die completely. At 7:30, the first text came, running late, sorry. At 9, the second, don't wait up. Evan stared at the message until the screen dimmed. He knew disappointment too well to even feel anger. Instead, he collected the untouched food, stored it carefully, and turned off the lights one by one. When lightning flashed outside, he realized how fiercely the storm had strengthened. The hallway lights flickered as he opened the door to check the balcony latch. The moment he stepped into the corridor, he found Cade there too, struggling with a large cardboard box he hadn't sealed properly. The storm had blown it against his door, scattering a few items across the floor. Cade looked up, startled. Sorry. Didn't mean to create chaos out here. You didn't, Evan said, kneeling to help gather a few books. The weather's just determined to win tonight. As they collected everything, thunder cracked overhead, making the corridor lights dim again. Cade shook his head toward his apartment. You want to wait it out inside? The storm's getting worse. Evan hesitated. Not because he doubted the invitation, but because he feared what accepting it meant about his own life. But the hallway lights flickered again, and the choice dissolved. Just for a bit, he said quietly. Inside, Cade lit a warm lamp, instantly making the space feel safe and lived in. Evan sat on the sofa while Cade retrieved a towel for his wet sleeves. The small gesture carried a softness that felt unexpectedly overwhelming. You okay? Cade asked, settling into a nearby chair. Just tired, Evan admitted. It's been a long day. Cade didn't push for details. He simply nodded, giving Evan room to breathe. The storm outside grew louder, but in the soft lamplight, the world seemed smaller, almost gentle. Evan felt the tension in his chest slowly loosening. They talked, quietly, cautiously, about nothing and everything. About music. About why people stay in places that no longer feel like home. About the strange ache of wanting connection and not knowing where to find it. At one point, Evan rested his hands on his knees, and Cade leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You seem like someone who carries more than he says, Cade murmured. Evan met his gaze. Maybe. He didn't move closer, didn't let the moment turn into something dangerous. But something unspoken passed between them, recognition, empathy, awareness. When the storm finally eased, Evan stood reluctantly. I should go back. Yeah, Cade said, offering a nod that felt almost protective. But, if you ever need company, I'm right here. Evan paused at the doorway, the kind of pause that held its own meaning. I know. He returned to his apartment, closing the door gently, as though he feared breaking whatever fragile clarity he had gained. Morgan still hadn't come home, and for the first time, Evan didn't wait up. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the soft fading rumble of thunder, and realized that loneliness didn't feel the same tonight. Something had shifted, quietly, but undeniably, and the shift had started across the hall. Morgan returned home late the next morning, his clothes damp from the storm and his expression pulled tight with the tension of someone walking into a test he hadn't prepared for. Evan was at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee he no longer tasted. The moment Morgan stepped inside, the air shifted, thick, hesitant, threaded with yesterday's silence. "You were up early," Morgan said, pulling off his coat without meeting Evan's eyes. "I couldn't sleep," Evan replied, offering nothing more. They stood in the kitchen like two people who used to know how to move around each other. Morgan reached for a mug, but his phone vibrated before he filled it. He glanced at the screen and turned away, lowering his voice, as if protecting a secret. Evan didn't try to decode the whispers. He simply watched Morgan's back, the distance, the caution, the detachment. When Morgan finally hung up, he exhaled sharply. "Work," he said. "Things are complicated right now." Evan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had heard the same explanation so many times it had lost all meaning. Morgan hesitated, then leaned against the counter, arms folded. "We should talk later." I'm trying, Evan." "Trying to what?" Evan asked softly. Morgan opened his mouth but closed it just as quickly, as though the answer was too tangled to unravel. Instead, he grabbed his keys and left with a half-hearted promise to be back early, a phrase that had become almost rhetorical. After the door closed, Evan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The quiet settled around him like dust, clinging to every surface that he tried to work, but every sketch felt hollow. His thoughts drifted back to last night, the storm, the lamplight in Cade's apartment, the relief of being truly seen. It wasn't desire, he insisted. It wasn't betrayal. It was recognition, the kind that slipped through cracks he didn't know had formed. Hours passed with the sluggishness of emotional fatigue. When Evan finally stepped into the hallway for some fresh air, he almost collided with Morgan rounding the corner. The surprise on Morgan's face was immediate, but something else flickered beneath it, something sharp. "Where were you last night?" Morgan asked, voice lower than usual. "Here," Evan answered, startled by the defensive tone. Mostly. "Mostly?" Morgan's gaze narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means I took a walk. Then the storm hit. I waited out part of it with Cade." The moment Evan said Cade's name, Morgan's expression hardened. A spark of suspicion flared, quick and unmistakable. "Cade?" Morgan repeated slowly. "The new guy. He lives across the hall," Evan replied, growing uneasy. "It wasn't anything, I didn't ask for a story," Morgan snapped, then caught himself, inhaling deeply as if swallowing his frustration. "I just didn't realize you two were friendly." Evan's chest constricted. "It was a storm, Morgan." He offered a place to sit until it eased. "Right," Morgan said, though the skepticism in his voice was impossible to ignore. Before Evan could respond, the elevator dinged, and Cade stepped out, holding a bag of groceries. The moment he saw Morgan's tense posture and Evan's stiff expression, he slowed, scrutinizing the air between them with cautious intuition. "Morning," Cade said, lifting the grocery bag slightly. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Morgan's jaw tightened. "We were talking." Cade nodded carefully. "All right." The tension grew roots, burrowing into the cracks between the three men. Evan felt heat rising in his chest, embarrassment, frustration, something deeper. "We can finish later," Morgan said abruptly, though his voice carried an edge that didn't match the words. "I have things to do." He brushed past them both, disappearing into the apartment with a final glance at Cade that held far too much hostility for such a simple moment. Cade waited until the door closed before speaking. "Everything okay?" Evan forced a breath through his lungs. "Not exactly." Cade didn't pry. Instead, he shifted the groceries in his arms. "If you need anything, I'm around." Evan managed a faint, grateful smile. "I know." Later that evening, Morgan returned earlier than expected, without warning, without his usual excuses. Evan was on the balcony, listening to the dull hum of the city, when Morgan slid the glass door open. "We should talk," Morgan said, his tone both weary and defensive. Evan followed him inside, bracing himself. Morgan stood near the dining table, arms crossed, eyes hard with unspoken fears. "I don't like how close you seem with him," he said, skipping pretense entirely. Evan blinked. "We've talked a few times." "That's it." "You don't see it," Morgan muttered. "The way he looks at you." Evan felt heat crawl up his neck. "He's been kind to me. Nothing more." "You're lonely," Morgan said, the words quick and cutting. "And he's taking advantage of it." Evan flinched, not from the accusation itself but from how deeply it echoed his private wounds. "I'm lonely," he said quietly, "because you haven't been here." Morgan stiffened. "You think I don't notice you slipping away?" "Slipping?" Evan asked, incredulous. "I've been waiting. 4 months. For you to show up. For you to look at me. For you to ask me a single thing about my day." Morgan turned away, rubbing the back of his neck with both hands. "You don't understand what I'm dealing with at work." "Then tell me," Evan insisted. "Let me in. Stop shutting me out." Morgan went still, the tension inside him coiling tighter. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with something raw. "I haven't been shutting you out. I just didn't know how to tell you that I've been close to someone at the office." The words hit like a sudden temperature drop. Evan stared, unable to speak. He had sensed distance, yes, but he hadn't expected confession. It wasn't physical, Morgan continued quickly, guilt leaking into his voice. "Just emotional. I didn't mean for it to happen." Evan sank into a chair, breath unsteady. "So I was right," he whispered. "You haven't been here with me for a long time." Morgan shut his eyes, shoulders collapsing. "I'm sorry, Evan. I didn't want it to mean anything. But it did." The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full, painful, heavy, undeniable. Morgan stepped closer. "I want to fix this." Evan looked up, eyes stinging with the grief of hearing something far too late. "I don't know if we can fix something you stopped holding." They stood there, two people who had once promised to share a life, now standing in the ruins neither had acknowledged soon enough. When Evan finally retreated to the balcony, the night air felt colder than usual. He looked toward the hallway, where a soft sliver of light leaked from beneath Cade's door, not an invitation, not a temptation, just a reminder of the one place where, lately, he didn't feel invisible, and the realization made his heart ache in ways that had nothing to do with guilt, only truth. Evan woke the next morning with a sense of quiet unease. The previous night's encounter lingered in his thoughts, not the laughter or the polite introductions, but the way Caleb's attention had softened when Liam entered the room. It was subtle, nearly imperceptible to anyone else, yet it struck Evan with the force of recognition. Something had shifted, and it was no longer confined to hushed glances or missed conversations at a tea breakfast. Caleb seemed distracted, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as though he were mentally elsewhere. He smiled at Evan when spoken to, but the warmth felt delayed, filtered through an invisible veil. Evan chose not to comment immediately, instead watching the familiar movements, the way Caleb's hand lingered near his mug a moment longer than necessary, and the faint crease between his brows that hadn't been there before. "You're quiet today," Caleb remarked, finally breaking the tension with a casual tone. "Just thinking," Evan said, letting his words hang. "About work, life, whatever." Caleb nodded, but his eyes flicked toward the phone charging on the counter. Evan noticed how quickly Caleb's gaze returned to his plate, almost as if he were guarding his own attention. Something about the timing felt deliberate. Not malicious, not deceitful, but careful. Careful enough that Evan sensed a deeper story simmering beneath the surface. The day unfolded with its usual rhythm, Evan working from home, Caleb disappearing for meetings and phone calls, the silence between them stretching thin. Yet even in the routine, Evan detected subtle changes. Caleb's messages were shorter, his laughter lighter, almost rehearsed. Evan wondered whether he imagined it, or whether Caleb was consciously building a wall he hadn't yet acknowledged. By evening, Evan decided he could no longer ignore the feeling. He suggested a walk through the neighborhood, hoping that movement and fresh air would loosen the invisible tension. Caleb agreed, seemingly without hesitation, but Evan noted the brief hesitation in his posture, the way his shoulders tensed as they stepped out into the cool twilight. They walked side by side, passing familiar streets and streetlights casting long shadows. Evan chose his words carefully, cautious not to confront, only to invite. "Are you happy?" he asked. Caleb's stride faltered, and he glanced at Evan briefly before looking ahead. "I think so. Some days are better than others." Evan didn't press, though he sensed the avoidance. He had learned over the years that pressing too hard often led to walls, not answers. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that Caleb's quiet wish, the one he carried like a secret weight, was becoming more tangible, more insistent. A few days later, Evan noticed a new pattern: Caleb leaving the house with his laptop bag in the morning, returning later than he claimed, his energy slightly elevated after long phone calls. Evan observed the changes in small increments, cataloging each as if they were puzzle pieces, hoping they would form a coherent picture. But they did not. Instead, they created tension, unease, and the persistent hum of suspicion. Then, one afternoon, Evan discovered a small, folded note tucked under a stack of mail. The handwriting was unmistakable, Caleb's. He hesitated before unfolding it, unsure whether he wanted to read it or leave it for another day. But curiosity, mingled with fear. The note was brief, almost fragile. "I wish I could tell you everything. But I don't know if I can. I hope you'll understand someday." Evan's hands trembled slightly as he refolded the paper. Nothing explicit, nothing detailed, just a quiet admission of longing, a confession that something unspoken existed between them. The words confirmed what Evan had suspected all along: Caleb carried a wish, a desire, a thought he hadn't yet shared. But the note offered no clarity on whether that wish included Evan or someone else entirely. The tension in the house grew heavier after that. Evan began noticing Caleb's subtle gestures toward Liam, the way Caleb's voice brightened when he spoke of project deadlines that coincided with Liam's visits, or the way he lingered on Liam's messages, smiling softly when reading them alone in another room. Evan didn't want to confront, didn't want to accuse. But he couldn't ignore the evidence his own heart and mind were piecing together. One evening, Evan found himself alone in the living room, scrolling through his own thoughts more than any actual messages. He realized that Caleb's affection for him was still there. It hadn't disappeared, but it was shaded now, filtered through unspoken emotions. The man he loved was struggling between the life they had built and a desire he hadn't shared. And the longer it remained unsaid, the further Evan felt himself from the person he thought he knew. When Caleb returned home that night, he seemed restless. The usual calmness was replaced by a subtle energy, a vibration Evan could feel when he stepped into the room. Caleb spoke softly, almost cautiously. "Evan. I need to tell you something." Evan's stomach tightened. He had waited for this moment, dreaded it, and hoped for it all at once. "Okay," he said. His voice was steady, but his pulse raced. Caleb hesitated, his eyes searching Evan's face as if measuring how much of the truth could be revealed without shattering them both. Then, just as he began to speak, a notification chimed on his phone. Caleb's expression shifted, and he turned away, swiping the screen with practiced ease. "I'll tell you later," Caleb murmured. Evan swallowed the disappointment, sensing that the conversation he needed most would be delayed again. The night continued with polite routine: dinner, laughter faintly forced, an early retreat to separate rooms. But the weight of Caleb's unspoken words pressed down on Evan, heavier than anything he could have imagined. As Evan lay awake, he replayed every interaction, every glance, every smile Caleb had given Liam in recent days. The images weren't dramatic, not threatening, but they were intimate in a way only emotional connection can be. Evan understood, with a painful clarity, that Caleb's quiet wish was no longer a vague thought. It had taken form, and its gravity reached far beyond the walls of their apartment. By the time dawn broke, Evan made a silent promise to himself: he would confront the truth, whatever it was. He didn't yet know how, or when, or what he would find. But he knew that the quiet wish Caleb carried would not remain hidden much longer, and that when it surfaced, nothing would ever be the same. It was no longer just tension or distance. It was a turning point, and Evan felt it in the hollow ache of anticipation, the awareness that love and longing can coexist, even when their paths diverged. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable, knowing that the coming days would force choices, revelations, and consequences he could no longer avoid. And with that understanding came the first real stirrings of fear, hope, and a fragile courage he didn't yet fully recognize.